So I have an extra special poem for you guys tonight. It kind of sent me down a bit of a rabbit hole to understand what the heck I was even reading. So, for some context, during the Japanese Edo period, which was like the 17th to the 19th century, um, there was a style of poetry that was popular called Kyōka. Kyōka itself is a subgenre of tanka, and tanka itself is a subgenre of waka. Waka poetry typically has like a type of rhyming meter within Japanese poetry, which is like 5/7 something. Waka poetry still exists. People still make waka poetry, and people still make tanka poetry. Tanka poetry is a specific sort of rhyming meter. The reason why this specific genre of poetry existed during this time period was there was a type of poetry called Getsudôken, which was sort of a roast style mocking poetry that came into popularity, and it would be like popular at banquets during this time. And then low-level samurai of the time started getting their hands on this type of poetry and making their own versions of it. And this later became known as Kyōka when it started getting like published, which was like I guess towards like the end of the 18th century. So it's like sort of very playful style poetry, and so you'll see these in these really pretty like Japanese prints, like these old books with like this kind of fun scrawling poetry, usually with some illustrations, kind of like highlighting this stuff. And this particular poem that I'm going to read to you comes from this. It's a Kyōka style poem. This was written about in this book called Mad in Translation, which was by Robin Gill, which they had translated a bunch of like Japanese poetry. And it's just really interesting because even like the way that you would read these poems, like the way that Japanese was written, you'd read it slightly differently than you'd read it nowadays. And even the meanings of these words have sort of different meanings. It's a very brief poem, but here goes. It goes, Marukute, Marukute, ana yama kara choto, dero o chato, suishita, kore mo usagi ja. And you can translate this in a lot of ways. You can translate it literally, and the literal translation of it is just rough. And you'll be like, what the heck does it even mean? But so Robin Gill kind of like did a little bit of a translation on it so it's a bit more understandable. It goes, the way it starts from that mountain there, soft and round, timorously peeking out, could it really be a hare? This poem was by Getsudôken, which I have trouble finding any information about Getsudôken other than what was mentioned in this book, and it's very little, other than that they wrote some very lewd poetry as well, which I won't go into. But this particular poem is like, okay, what does this even mean? Like round, like over a mountain, and like, could it be a hare? Well, okay, so this is again sending me further down this rabbit hole of like, what the heck? It's just so specifically Japanese. Okay, so I guess there is this like kind of conceptual thing of like there's a rabbit in the moon. I guess this sort of came from like a Chinese perception of like the like sort of the pattern in the moon looked like a rabbit. And then like Japanese took this to see it as like there was a rabbit sort of pounding with a mortar and pestle rice mochi. And yeah, and okay, so like this idea came, I guess, partially due to the fact that like when a husband and wife are pounding rice mochi cake, they'll go really wild with the mortar and pestle, and maybe this kind of looks like the rabbit in the moon. I have no idea. It's weird, but there's like lots of Japanese prints that show this exact thing. And so like this weirdly specific Kyōka poem from the Edo period is referencing this weirdly specific rabbit thing about the rabbit in the moon, which is why I'm holding my little Kirby rabbit and having my moon shirt on. But it's so weird to me that there's like this really specific, it's just so Japanese. In any case, I hope you enjoyed this sort of little rabbit hole that I went down to understand this very, very brief poem from the 1700s. Anyways,